أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين وبعد. Today we are in the 7th chapter of the Metaphysics of the Cure, Ilahiyat al-Shifa of Ibn Sina. Last time, of course, we looked at chapter 6, and in chapter 6, there was a discourse on the nature of on the necessary existent, or wajib al-wujud, and a detailed discussion of necessary being, contingent being, and impossibility or impossible being. And much of that chapter was spent in establishing that the wajib al-wujud, or necessary existent, has no equivalent in existence. That, as it says in Arabic, وَأَنَّ الْوَاجِبَ الْوُجُودَ غَيْرْ مُكَافِئٍ لِغَيْرِهِ فِي الْوُجُودِ. That the necessary existent, in the translation of Michael Marmura, has no equivalent in existence. Now, chapter 7 has only one goal, and that is, or one topic, and that is to establish that necessary existent is one. في أن واجب الوجود واحد. Okay? This is a rather long chapter, and Ibn Sina, like many philosophers of the past and of the present, often does not express himself or explain himself very clearly. So what we will do is we will discuss a few points, and then I will try and present my own version of what he is trying to prove in a much clearer language. Now, one thing to realize here is that the word wahid in the text, في أن واجب الوجود واحد. What do we do with this? So he says in the Arabic text, in paragraph 1, this is page 34 of the Michael Marmura edition, and in the Arabic text it's line 10, and in the English text it's line 16. He says, وَنَقُولُ أَيْضًا, we further say, إِنَّ وَاجِبَ الْوُجُودِ يَجِبُ أَنْ يَكُونَ ذَاتًا وَاحِدَةً. The necessary existent must be one entity. So here it's wahida, and in the title it's wahid. There's no problem here. It's just a difference of the grammatical gender, because in the title it refers back to wajib al-wujud, which is grammatically masculine, and here it refers back to the term that, and that is grammatically feminine. Of course, the necessary existent is beyond such distinctions of gender, grammatical, or biological, or otherwise. Now, what I would like to focus on is, how do we interpret the word wahid? How do we understand that? And the answer is, you can't really approach the term wahid in a mathematical or a numerical sense. It doesn't work. it does not work. So you have to keep in mind that you cannot use the term wahid in a mathematical or arithmetical sense. To do so is to fall into a profound error. So when he translates it here as the necessary existent is one, the necessary existent must be one entity, this is a problem. Now, if we refer, it's relevant here to refer to, of course, the Quran. I said to you, I think that chapter 6 of the Shifa from the first maqala, which we dealt with in the last two lectures, is a kind of expansion of certain doctrines or ideas which are expressed in the 112th surah of the Quran, Surah al-Ikhlas. And there it says, قُلْ هُوَ اللَّهُ أَحَدٌ. Now many people translate that as say, He is God the One. And when they translate in Urdu also, sometimes they'll say, for one they'll say ek. Now in the Nahjul Balagha, however, Amir al-Mu'mineen Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salam, in khutbah 152, after praising God, he further on in the khutbah describes him as al-Ahad bila ta'widi adad, which is extremely important. In other words, he refers to Allah as al-Ahad, the One, without being construed numerically. Also, in another khutbah 185 of the Nahj al-Balagha, after praising God, there instead of Ahad, the term Wahid is used, and God is described as Wahidun bila adad. So in both instances here, the oneness, if you like, of God is referred to, but it is explained as being non-numerical, non-arithmetical. It is not a number. This is important to understand because the number 1 may be added to itself and thus give rise to 2, and so on, for all of the numbers. So it is important to understand that God is not one. And what we really should say is that God is unique, that necessary being is unique. So I would say that it's better to translate this passage in the text where it says fi anna wajibul wujud wahidun, and say that the necessary existent is unique. Now, I'm not sure how. Yeah, it might be worth checking. Let's see how they translate this in different languages. So for example, قُلْ هُوَ اللَّهُ أَحَدٌ. How is that translated into? Let's see. For example, let's check some translations very quickly. Here is. Excuse me, I'm on the wrong page. Tabbat yada abi lahab. This should be the next one. قُلْ هُوَ اللَّهُ أَحَدٌ. Yeah, it's surprising. So in the Urdu translation of Allama Zishan Haidar Jawadi, it's "E Rasul keh dijiye ki wo Allah ek hai." Uses the word ek or one. Let's check a Farsi translation. Here's Abdul Majid Ayati. Let's see what he says. Let's see. He did it right, you see. Begu ust khudaye yakta. Keh do ki khuda yakta hai. Yakta as a word in Persian is unique. Yakta or the word yagane in Persian would work. It would also work in Urdu. In English you'd have to say unique. Let's check this ancient Persian, this classic Persian translation of Surah. You see, Begu Khuda Yagana ast. That's the Persian translation of Shah Waliullah Muhaddis Dehlawi. All right. So I'm not sure about English translations, but if you're going to translate in English, you've got to say unique. Yeah.
Yeah, it says the most widely held interpretation is that Wahid is a numerical one to which another number can be added, while Ahad denotes an absolute oneness that is unique and cannot take a second or be divided. This is, I was just taking this study of Quran.
Yeah, the study Quran. So that's correct. Let's see another translation in Urdu. Let's see the translation of Maulana Tilmiz Hasnain Rizvi, may Allah preserve him. Let's see, what does he say? Farma dijiye wo Allah yakta hai. So he also has yakta. Let's see, Ali Quli Qara'i. So far, all the translations we've consulted are Shia translations, with the exception of Shah Waliullah, that's a Sunni translation. Quli Qara'i is also a Shia translation. Let's see what it says. Okay. Yeah, he says, say he is Allah the One. I don't like that. Okay. Quli Qara'i has one. So let's check one last one. This is Muhammad Assad, Sunni translation, which is considered by some Sunni Muslims also to be a bit controversial, but I always find his English renderings to be often interesting. Let's see. He says, say he is the one God. Right, so you can see that many people miss this important point. So many people, many translations have passed over this problem. Or have not realized it. So it is important to distinguish then between mere oneness and uniqueness, or between unity.
The Arabic English dictionary by Hainsworth, he's also saying the one.
Sorry, your transmission is very garbled. What did you say about Arabic dictionaries?
The Arabic English dictionary I have.
Mm-hmm. The Hansard dictionary?
I had somebody, someone, anybody, anyone, and then Al-Ahad, the one God.
Yeah. Well, the dictionary isn't going to be much help here. The dictionary is not going to be much help here. This is less of a linguistic question than it is of a metaphysical question, because, because you can use these words differently in common ordinary usage, and here we have to be very careful because we're talking about a philosophical usage. So suffice it to say that this is the first point to realize, and this translation of wahid and wahida and so forth in this chapter throughout is one, which is a huge problem. Okay, now the rest of the problem in this chapter is that all he's trying to do is to prove that the necessary existent is unique. And he means unique. It comes out when you read the proof. The proof is not clear at all. And it's... No, everybody's not like Mullah. Mullah Sadr wrote very, very clear Arabic. It doesn't mean that the ideas are easy, but at least the language is clear. And Mullah Sadr does not Ibn Sina does not express himself in such a clear fashion as Mullah Sadr. And other writers were also very, very clear. Among philosophers, Ibn Rushd is very clear in his writing, for example. He has a very clear, readable Arabic style. Suhrawardi is also very readable, I think. Which is not to say that their ideas are easy or that these are easy books. No, it can't be. It's philosophy. So the other problem is that in the previous chapters, basically 5 and 6 are building up the idea of, are dealing with the ideas of necessity, contingency, impossibility, all with a view to establishing the existence of the necessary being. In other words, a proof for the existence of God. God understood as necessary being. But nowhere is a proof presented. No proof is presented in detail. And instead he goes into this detailed argument for establishing that the necessary existent or the necessary being, wajib al-wujud, is unique. So, in terms of establishing the existence of God, it's extremely brief. Now, brevity can be a sign of superficiality, and in this case it's not, but nevertheless it is a cause of tremendous obscurity. So it's not really clear how you would establish in detail, on the basis of the distinction between necessity and contingency, the existence of necessary being, and then you would have to prove that this necessary being is unique. In other words, once you prove the existence of necessary being, you haven't proved that that necessary being is all by himself or all by itself. That has to be established next. So Ibn Sina doesn't do this anywhere. In these chapters, in the the Isharat, in al-Isharat wa Tanbihat, the remarks and admonitions, he does spell out this stuff in more detail. And he's very proud of this proof for the existence of God, and in fact he calls it Burhan al-Siddiqeen. Now none of this is mentioned in the Shifa. Burhan al-Siddiqeen might be translated as the demonstration of the supremely sincere, or the supremely, Siddiq can have the sense of of great sincerity. It can also have the sense of great veracity. Because sidq also has it conveys the idea of truth, not just sincerity, and veracity, is related to the Latin, I think, veritas, which also means truth. So someone who is characterized by veracity is that they have a deep wisdom and insight. So it could also be called the proof of the superbly veracious, which is what I usually translate it as. So what I think is worth doing is maybe giving a summary account of how you would actually go about doing such a proof in modern language, and then having once established the existence of necessary being, then establishing that necessary being is unique. Okay? So I actually have a text on this, which I used to give to my classes. And I think I sent it to you, and if not, I'll send it to you now. I have a PDF of it, and it also has some other useful things in it. But it's basically Ibn Sina's proof for the existence of God, or the proof for the existence of necessary being. So I don't know if you have a copy. Do you have a copy?
Is it by itself, or is it in the part?
Yeah, I can't understand what you're saying today. The connection is very bad. It has it's called a cosmological argument for the existence of Allah, Ibn Sina's argument by contingency.
I don't think I have it.
Okay, so I'm going to run through it, and he doesn't do this. So I'm just going to run through it and then explain how necessary being is unique. And this will also involve logic and so forth. So Ibn Sina's got a famous proof which is based on contingency. And like I said, he doesn't really go through this in the Shifa, but he does mention it in more detail in al-Isharat wa tanbihat, where he calls it Burhan al-Siddiqeen. And he considers his proof to be superior to all previous proofs, all other proofs before him, since he considered his proof, his demonstration, his Burhan, to be based on the notion of existence itself. It's based on the idea of wujud itself. It's not based on causality, the connection between cause and effect. It's not based on the notion of huduth and qidam, or at-taghayyur, or these other sorts of ideas which we find in other demonstrations. So he's not basing himself on the nature of time, or on exploiting the notion of an infinite regress, which you find in the so-called Kalam, cosmological argument. He's not basing his argument on the basis of change or motion, which is what we find in Aristotle before. All of these kind of arguments which I've mentioned are known as cosmological arguments. There is a very interesting book on cosmological arguments. Oh, first I should explain what it is. Are you familiar with this idea of the cosmological argument? A cosmological argument for the existence of God proceeds or takes its point of departure some feature of the universe, some fact about the cosmos, and then argues from that feature or that fact to its conclusion, namely that there is a necessary being, that there is a God, where God is understood as necessary being, or as the unmoved mover, in the case of Aristotle, the unchanging basis of all change and transformation, the creator of the universe, things like this. And there's a very important and very readable book by someone named William Lane Craig. Now, William Lane Craig, I should tell you, is a Protestant Christian, and he's a very popular lecturer and debater. He has a degree in philosophy, but he is an evangelical Christian. Nevertheless, he has written a very nice book called The Cosmological Argument. I think it's called The Cosmological Argument from Aquinas to Leibniz. And he also has a famous book on what's called the Kalam, cosmological argument. This was an argument which was employed very much by the mutakallimun of Islam, the theologians of Islam. But it wasn't a proof which was very much liked by the philosophers. And it's known as the Kalam cosmological argument, although it probably has its roots before Islam. When figures in certain Christian figures, I think it's John Philoponus. In any case, that's one kind of proof. So, what is the fact or feature of the cosmos that Ibn Sina wishes to exploit or employ as his point of departure in making this proof? Well, it's contingency. So obviously for a cosmological argument, you need, as I said already, some fact or some feature of the cosmos, some fact about the universe, some feature of the cosmos, which is your point of departure. So you really cannot deny that a cosmos exists. If you're one of those kinds of thinkers who deny, then we have a problem. So we must acknowledge that the cosmos exists, that it is real. And then we observe that in this universe, in the cosmos, there are innumerable relationships. In fact, there's a web of relationships interconnecting a vast range of things together on every scale of observation and experience, from the microscopic to the astronomical, inside the external world as well as in our mind, our subjective experience, if you like. And so you could take any feature, any thing in this universe. So if you take a living organism, for example, then that living organism, a cat or a dog or a horse, for example, depends on all of the physical elements that make it that animal. Its bones, its muscles, its organs, its cells, making up all the tissues, the structure of those cells, the molecular structure of the cells, the atomic structure of the individual molecules, the subatomic structure of those atoms. When you keep going further and further down, so to speak, you'll end up with all of that ultimately resting upon, at least according to modern physics, the four fundamental forces. And those four fundamental forces are gravity, electromagnetism, the strong nuclear force, and the weak nuclear force. The strong nuclear force is the force that holds together the nucleons, the protons, and the neutrons, and then the weak nuclear force is the force that, holds the electrons in place around the nucleus, and so on and so forth. And then there's all these associated biological, chemical, physiological, molecular, atomic, and subatomic processes involved in the proper functioning of all these elements working together to make it a cat or a dog or a horse or what have you. And without all of those, then such an animal or an organism would not exist. Now, these kind of observations could also be made about pretty much anything, a tree, a block of granite, or anything in the cosmos. What that comes down to is that all such phenomena are contingent, or they constitute contingent entities. Now, the problem is, as we said, as Ibn Sina pointed out, or he alludes to anyway, and it's mentioned in more detail by people like Nizamuddin in the Tajdeed, that necessity, contingency, and impossibility are really self-evident. They're not really definable. So we can't really define contingency, but we can talk about contingent entities, or we can understand what we mean when something is contingent. And so what I'm going to say is I would give a definition, not in a strict logical sense, or not even a description, but just a explication of the word to sort of bring about some understanding in the mind of the person that I'm talking to or addressing. And then I would simply say that a contingent entity is any entity, anything which is dependent on another entity or another thing for its existence or occurrence. And furthermore, I would say that any contingent entity, or a particular contingent entity, may itself function as a condition for another contingent entity. And in that case, we could describe the given contingent entity as a condition for the other contingent entity. So we would use the term condition and contingent entity almost interchangeably. Now, if we understand then what is meant by a contingent entity, then the question naturally arises: is there an utterly non-contingent entity or reality? By non-contingent entity or reality, I mean an entity that does not depend on any other entity of any kind for its existence or occurrence. That is necessary being. That's another way of explaining necessity. Now, it's clear, it's true that there will be a certain amount of there will be circularity in these definitions. We can't really, as has been said before, define necessity or impossibility or contingency without circularity. But we can have an intuitive understanding of what is meant by them. So our question then comes down to this: the existence of contingent entities subject to a vast range of other conditions or contingencies or other contingent entities, that is what we observe. It is not a matter of dispute. That is the universe. That is what exists in the cosmos all around us. So then we need to ask the question that in all of reality, is there a non-contingent entity or not? Stated in other words, there either is no non-contingent entity, which would mean that there is no necessary being, or there is at least one non-contingent entity, which is just another way of saying that at least one necessary being does exist. Now, it's important to understand that these two alternatives give us give us a complete disjunction. منفصلة حقيقية in mantiq. And that these two sides, الشقين الشقان هذان الشقان, or these two and only these two sides or these two propositions cover all logical possibilities because they are mutually exclusive. And by the law of excluded middle in logic, there is no third option. So our first proposition is there is no non-contingent entity in all of reality. We could denote that by negative n, minus n, or false n, negation of n. And then n, our second proposition, n, would be that there is at least one non-contingent entity in all of reality. And so n and not n are mutually exclusive. They form a complete disjunction. So this is just how we would set up the proposition. How we would set up the disjunction consisting of these two propositions. If you want to put it in theological language, either God exists, either there is at least one God, or there is no God. Right? Other equivalent forms of not n would be there is no necessary being in all reality, or in all reality there are only contingent entities, there are only contingent entities in all of reality, and so forth. So if we can prove not n as being false, if we can establish that not n, there is no non-contingent entity in all of reality, is false, then our second proposition, in other words, that there is at least one non-contingent entity in all of reality, is going to be true. But not only is it going to be true, it must be true logically. Okay, so if you disprove one side of a complete disjunction, that means that the other side has to be true by the laws of logic. So that's how you have to frame the problem. So is that clear up to this point?
Yes.
So then after this, you have to examine this proposition, which we are calling not n. You write a capital N with a minus sign in front of it. That just means negation. That proposition, once again, is there is no non-contingent entity in all of reality. That's proposition not n. Under that proposition, that means what? It means that if we come across in the cosmos, in the universe, any contingent entity, call it C as in Charlie, it can depend on a finite number of conditions or an infinite number of conditions. Because if you have any contingent entity, by quote unquote definition, not logical definition, but by contingency means its dependence on some set of conditions. And that set of conditions, it's that the number of those conditions can be finite, or we could have an infinite chain, an infinite number of conditions, right? So finite or not finite, that is also a complete disjunction. So if not n is true, it must be one or the other, not neither, not both. Both options cannot be false since all possibilities are exhausted by these two mutually exclusive options. Both cannot be true either, since this would violate the law of non-contradiction. So under the proposition not n, we then come up with two further propositions, which we can call f and not f. By f, I mean the finite hypothesis. Any contingent entity C depends on a finite number of conditions. And not f would be any contingent entity C depends on an infinite number of conditions. So now we come, having taken the negative portion of the original disjunction of not n, that gives rise to another complete disjunction of f or not f. So f I'm going to refer to as the finite hypothesis from now on, and not f I'm going to refer to as the infinite hypothesis. So if we take the finite hypothesis, it means that any contingent entity C is dependent only on a finite number of conditions. So you have the first and the second and the third and so on and so forth, up to some number n. Okay, so that means that that chain of conditions or contingencies has to end with a final contingency, which is the most fundamental or the last condition or the final contingency or the terminal condition, you can call it by many things, on which the existence of this contingent entity C depends. But our original proposition, not n, asserts that there is no necessary being in all reality. But that is true if and only if there are only contingent beings in all reality. Is that clear?
Yes.
So that means there can only be contingent beings. Therefore, the final condition under the finite hypothesis on which the existence of any contingent being C depends is also a contingent entity, since under the proposition of not n, there are only contingent entities in all reality. So this last condition must also have conditions, since by the original proposition not n, it too is a contingent entity. But its conditions cannot be fulfilled because it is supposed to be the terminating condition, because under hypothesis F, which is the finite hypothesis, there's only a finite number of them. But a contingent entity whose conditions are not fulfilled cannot be said to exist at all. It's literally nothing, no thing, and therefore does not exist. It is non-existent. In other words, proposition not n combined with the finite hypothesis F requires that the most fundamental condition, its terminal condition, be non-existent. Then all contingent entities hypothetically dependent on it would also have to be non-existent, in which case the given contingent entity, C, would never exist. Therefore, no contingent entity can exist under proposition not n, under hypothesis F. Also, therefore, hypothesis F under not n must be false for all contingent entities in all reality. We are thus left with not F, or what's called the infinite hypothesis. So we saw that, well, the finite hypothesis doesn't work, so now we have to examine the infinite hypothesis. So under the infinite hypothesis, that means, again, if we take some contingent entity, call it C as in Charlie, then that means that for all such C's, for all such contingent entities in all reality, C, or that contingent entity, depends on an infinity of conditions. So we could denote them by some other letter, X if you like. So you'd have X1, small x, X2, X3, Xn, Xn plus 1, X infinity. And so all of those would have to be fulfilled for that contingent entity C to exist. What does that mean? That entails that there is no condition, X infinity, such that it is the most fundamental, last, final, or terminal condition, because it's an infinite chain, right? So if there is no last contingency, there is no terminal contingency or terminal condition, then the number of conditions or contingencies upon which any given contingent entity C depends is always one more than can ever be achieved, and is therefore unachievable. So if any given contingent entity C depends on an unrealizable number of conditions being fulfilled for it to exist, then what does that mean? It means it will never exist. That means, that is to say, given any contingent entity, capital C, and that capital C depends on a condition, let's say x1, which depends on a condition x2, which depends on a condition x3, which depends on a condition xn, which depends on some other condition all the way up to infinity in order for C to come into existence. But C will never come into existence since its conditions will never be fulfilled. Therefore, no contingent entity C can exist under the infinite hypothesis either. Thus, both hypotheses under not N are false, which violates the law of non-contradiction. And that means that what? That proposition not N is also false. That means that there is no non-contingent entity in all reality is false. We have proved it. So what does that mean? It means that the other part of the disjunction is true. In other words, if both hypothesis F and hypothesis not F, in other words, the hypothesis of a finite number of contingencies and the hypothesis of an infinite number of contingencies, which are both mutually exclusive and form a complete disjunction, if both are false for any contingent C, for any contingent entity C, under the proposition not N, that there is no non-contingent entity in all of reality. And if both of those hypotheses, F and not F, represent the whole range of possibilities, and so there's no other alternative, then no contingent entity can exist under those hypotheses. And if no contingent entity can exist under either or both of those hypotheses, F and not F, then that means there cannot be only contingent entities in all reality. Therefore, by the disjunctive syllogism, all right, so we have shown then that we have a complete disjunction in which we say that either there is only let me rephrase. So our complete disjunction was that there is no non-contingent entity in all of reality, or there is at least one non-contingent entity in all of reality. And so what we tried to show is that this idea that there is no non-contingent entity in all of reality does not hold up, because that would imply that means that there are only contingent entities in all of reality. So any contingent thing then would depend either on a finite number of conditions or an infinite number of conditions. And we showed that neither of those, and both of them, nor both of them, or one of them, or the other of them, can be true. Which means that only leaves us with the other part of the disjunction, which means that there must be at least one necessary being in all of reality. Okay. So, other sort of refinements and other sort of technical points could be mentioned in this argument. I mean, we could consider a circular set of conditions. We can talk about whether we can talk about the notion of the infinite series and so forth. There's various other points that could be mentioned, but this is the simplest kind of form of this proof. And typically in works like the Tajrid al-I'tiqad, they simply say it in a couple of lines. They say that, well, every mawjood, every existing thing is either mumkin or it's wajib. If it's wajib, then wajib al-wujud exists. If it is mumkin, if it is contingent, then it's contingent upon something else, and to avoid an infinite regress, there has to be a necessary being. And that's about all they say. And they don't really spell it out in such detail. And once they have done that, let's say once we have done that, what then can we say about such an entity? And that's basically, to ground this back to the Shifa, that's where Ibn Sina really picks it up or takes at his point of departure in chapter 7 from the first book, or Al-Fasl al-Sabi' min al-Maqalat al-Ula. And it is there that he wants to say, well, such an entity or reality or necessary being is absolutely unique. Now recall that in the... Whoops. We lost the Skype connection. Okay, I don't know what happened, that we lost the connection. The connection has been reestablished.
All of a sudden, no connection and then drops.
Okay. So Ibn Sina then picks it up from there. So we've got this necessary being. Now, what can we say about it? Well, again, he's trying to establish in this chapter that necessary being is unique. And he's already discussed in the chapter before that necessary being has no equivalent. So let us pause here, and I'll just give you my understanding of this. So we have proved that there is a necessary being, that at least one necessary being exists. Now we want to prove that this necessary being is unique, and we don't have 2 or 3 or 4 or what have you. But what is necessary being considered in and of itself? What is necessary being? Necessary being is pure, unconditioned reality without any admixture of anything else. You see, because it is necessary, it has no contingencies in it. And contingency also implies many, many other things. But let us simply focus on the fact that since it has no contingency, then necessary being exists in and of itself, intrinsically, through itself, and it is not a reality which is the cause of itself. We do not want to say that necessary being is the cause of itself. That will give us a dawr. That will give us a vicious circle. Necessary being does not exist through the fulfillment of any supposed conditions within it, but rather through having no conditions. Necessary being does not have any conditions. It has no contingencies. To assert or to claim that necessary being is the cause of itself is a fallacy. Why? Because it leads... It's cause of causes. No, it is the root in which all other causal chains are rooted, but it itself is not the cause of itself, because that leads to a vicious circle. In other words, it would imply that if necessary being is the cause of itself, it implies that necessary being existed before it existed in order to make itself exist. As I have said before, I think I said in the lesson we had on chapter 6, and that was split up into 2, so I don't remember in which of the 2 parts I said it, but I said that necessary being is a-causal.
Right.
It has no illah. So in that sense, necessary being, wajib al-wujud, grounds, quote unquote, so to speak, the fulfillment of all contingent things that depend ultimately on it. So necessary being is an ultimate doer, because contingency also implies a mixture of potency and act, of quwwa and fi'l. And wajib al-wujud is pure action. There is no potentiality in wajib al-wujud. Wajib al-wujud is the absolute simplicity of act in act. Okay? So every contingent thing, as I said, is a composite of potentiality and actuality. It's a murakkab of quwwa and fi'l. Its coming into existence is an actualization of a potentiality which is brought about through some efficient cause, through some agency, which was also dealt with in previous classes. Necessary being, however, is pure actuality. It has no cause. It has no intrinsic or extrinsic parameters or boundaries or restrictions. Wajibul wujud is capable of unrestrictedly acting in any ways which are not contradictory. In other words, it acts in any and all non-contradictory ways. And so, wajibul wujud is an all-inclusive entity. An entity or a reality, a haqiqah, that does not exclude anything from itself. Since it unifies all restricted realities, it must be distinct from them in virtue of the restricted boundaries of contingent entities. Let me explain that further. So, because wajibul wujud unifies all restricted realities, because a contingency is restricted in some way, it has to be distinct from them in virtue of the restricted boundaries of contingent entities. Nevertheless, wajibul wujud can unify them because wajibul wujud is simpler than contingencies. Indeed, wajibul wujud, necessary being, is utter simplicity, devoid of any composition. It is absolutely simple reality in act and is at once pure simplicity, pure act, pure power, pure inclusivity, pure being, and pure capacity to unify all things. Basitul haqiqa is the term that Mullah Sadr used. Ibn Sina doesn't use it, but Mullah Sadr used it. So now I would like to make the argument that necessary being is the simplest possible reality, and therefore it cannot be incompatible with any contingent entity because it must ground the fulfillment of all conditions of any contingent entity. Thus, no contingent entity can be incompatible with necessary being. That is to say, wajibul wujud, necessary being, is itself at the highest level of simplicity. Nothing is simpler than it. It is the apex of the Hiram Hasti, of the Haram al-Wujud, of the pyramid of existence. Okay, so this would seem to indicate that wajib al-Wujud is unique, yakta, yagane. It would seem to suggest this. But how do we prove that? Is it possible? Could we argue? Could we hypothesize that maybe there's more than one wajib al-wujud? Because so far, our proof only establishes the existence of at least one. So maybe there could be many. So now, how can we prove then that wajib al-wujud is unique? So we're addressing the question, can there be more than one wajib al-wujud? Can there be more than one necessary being? That's equivalent to asking, can there be multiple instances of wajib al-wujud? Can there be multiple instantiations of wajib al-wujud? But we already argued that wajib al-wujud is complete simplicity, it's basit. So then our question becomes, can there be multiple instantiations of this necessary being, which is utter simplicity? If the answer to that question is no, then this means that necessary being, wajib al-wujud, is unique. So now let's look at this. If there were more than one wajib al-wujud, if there were more than one necessary being, then there would be multiple cases, multiple instances, or we could say multiple instantiations of necessary being. In other words, there would be a number of necessary beings. So let's call these multiple instantiations I1, I2, I3, IN-1, and IN. However, since necessary being is utter simplicity, it's basit, this would entail that all of these instantiations of necessary being, I1 all the way up to IN, would also have to be utterly simple. For there genuinely to be multiple instantiations of necessary being, there would have to be some difference between these hypothetical multiple cases of necessary being. Otherwise, how could we distinguish them? Otherwise, they would all be the same. They would be indistinguishable. And if they're indistinguishable, then they're just one. They're unique. Okay, so for there to genuinely be some difference between Wajib al-Wujud number 1 and Wajib al-Wujud number 2 and Wajib al-Wujud number 3 and Wajib al-Wujud number n, then there must be some feature, some instantiating factor or factors, call it F, some feature which is distinct from any of the multiple instances of Wajib al-Wujud. Such an instantiating factor or factors or features F must exist. Otherwise, there would not be multiple cases or instances of Wajib al-Wujud, which would mean that this Wajib Wujud number 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and all the way up to n would be indistinguishable and therefore self-same and one. So the existence of such an instantiating or differentiating factor or quality or factors means that each instantiation of necessary being cannot be what? It cannot be truly, utterly basit or simple. That is to say that each such instantiation of necessary being would have to be unconditioned reality plus this feature or factor, which means that it cannot be unconditioned because it's conditioned by this feature, by this factor, and that means it's not necessary being. Such an instantiating factor or factors or features, whatever you want to call them, would also have to be less simple than Wajib al-Wujud in order to admit of real or really possible excluding differences on the same level of simplicity between these hypothetical multiple instances of Wajib al-Wujud. Otherwise, these distinct instances of Wajib al-Wujud on the highest level will not arise. Now, since this feature or factor, which would allow us to distinguish between Wajib al-Wujud 1, 2, 3, 4 up to n, would have to be less simple than Wajib al-Wujud and would have to be intrinsic to or effect every hypothetical multiple case of Wajib al-Wujud, then it would make each such case itself less simple than necessary being. Therefore, necessary being would have to be simpler than every instance or case or instantiation of it. And that is a contradiction. Therefore, any second, third, or up to n instantiations of Wajib al-Wujud would also have to be less simple than Wajib al-Wujud, which means that Wajib al-Wujud is the absolutely simplest reality, which is to say it is unique. So that means that Wajib al-Wujud, necessary being, stands alone and is unique, yakta, yagana, and there's nothing like it. So that is it. We have proved that not only must there be at least one necessary being, but this necessary being, Wajib al-Wujud, is utterly simple and unique. And that's it. And Ibn Sina, writes a lot and uses a different sort of language and so forth, but what I have told you comes down to his same conclusion, but I think in a better and clearer way. So that's what I have to say about the 7th chapter. I'm not going to read through the convoluted and tedious Arabic. If you want to read, you can compare what I've said with the English translation of Marmura and see that it comes down to the same thing. He introduces a slightly different way of dealing with it because if something is not simple, in other words, if something is murakkab, then there are different ways to envision this tarkeeb. You can talk about if something is not utterly simple, then it's going to have a genus and a specific difference, right? And we know that wujud has neither genus nor specific difference. So it takes that angle as well, which I didn't mention explicitly, but those are equivalent. That is an equivalent way of dealing with the problem. Okay, so I'm going to stop here. That is what I had to present. Wallahu a'lam.